Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Our webinar this morning is on Virginia's energy storage regulations. I'm Brad Nowak, partner and co-chair of Williams-Mullen's Renewable Energy Practice. I'm based in our Washington, D.C. office. I'm also pleased to be joined this morning by my colleague, Bob Riley. Bob is an energy partner and also co-chair of our energy storage team and solar team at Williams-Mullen. He also joins me from D.C. Before we begin our program, I have just a few housekeeping matters to go over. At any point during the presentation, you may submit questions by using the question button located on the lower part of your screen. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. If we don't have time, we'll reach out afterward and respond to those questions. Also, if you're having any audio or technical problems, please use that same question button and we'll help resolve. Finally, today's PowerPoint presentation will be emailed to everyone following today's webinar. This morning, we're going to cover some key aspects of the storage regulations, which were adopted by the Virginia State Corporation Commission late December. We've been assisting several clients in fielding many questions about the new energy storage regulations and how they apply to hybrid solar plus storage projects or standalone energy storage facilities, so we thought this webinar would be very timely. Before we discuss the regulations, I'll provide a brief background of the storage provisions in the Virginia Clean Economy Act, also known as the VCEA. Next, I'll address who is subject to the regulations, cover a few definitions, go over the minimum targets for energy storage deployment for Appalachian Power and Dominion, and also briefly mention licensing of energy storage aggregators. Bob will then pick up the presentation and address permitting of non-utility energy storage facilities and the regulations. He will also discuss recent legislation passed during the 2021 General Assembly session, expanding the definition of small renewable energy projects in the permit by rule statute to include energy storage. We covered the PBR expansion bill and other legislation pertaining to energy storage during a webinar last month. So if you'd like to check that out, feel free to visit our website where we have it posted on our solar and energy storage page. At the end, we hope to have some time for a few questions, so feel free to add your questions using that question button at the bottom of your screen. We've got a lot to cover this morning, so let's get started. So just to provide some of the background, the Virginia Clean Economy Act requires APCo to petition the Commission for approval to construct or acquire 400 megawatts, and for Dominion to petition the Commission for approval to construct or acquire 2,700 megawatts of new utility-owned energy storage resources by December 31st, 2035. The VCEA also required the Commission to adopt regulations to achieve the deployment of energy storage, including to set interim targets and update existing utility planning and procurement rules. The regulations were also to address competitive solicitations, behind-the-meter incentives, non-wires alternative programs, and peak demand reduction programs. So following the passage of the VCEA last year, in late June 2020, the SEC issued an order establishing a proceeding to establish energy storage rules and regulations. As part of the initial order, the SEC directed APCo and Dominion to submit comments and allowed other interested persons to also submit comments on 14 general questions relating to energy storage. The SEC received comments from a number of parties, including Dominion and APCo, and others, including energy storage developers and environmental and industry groups, including CHESA and SEA. So based on those comments, the SEC staff prepared draft rules. And in mid-September of last year, the SEC allowed parties to submit comments on those proposed rules. In mid-November, the SEC prepared its staff report summarizing the proposed rules for consideration. And in mid-December, the SEC issued its order adopting the regulations governing the deployment of energy storage. Those rules can be found at 20 VAC 5-335. And pursuant to the order, the storage rules are effective as of January 1 of this year. I just wanted to really briefly mention too that the SEC has established an energy storage task force to consider a number of other aspects relating to energy storage. The task force has already held several meetings, and there's some upcoming meetings. The task force is to prepare a report based on those discussions, which may include recommended changes or additions to the energy storage rules. So the rules that we cover today may be subject to change in the future. The SEC is required that the task force evaluation analysis be submitted to the General Assembly no later than October 1 of this year. So now to dive into the storage rules, who is subject to the rules? First, APCo and Dominion are subject to several rules relating to the minimum interim energy storage targets, procurement of energy storage projects, the behind-the-meter incentives, and a variety of programs, including the non-wire alternative and peak demand reduction programs, and several other provisions. Non-utility developers, owners, operators, and aggregators of energy storage are also subject to the rules. Bob's going to talk about licensing or getting a permit for energy storage facilities, but I'm going to cover licensing, registration, and marketing of energy storage aggregators. Finally, just a quick note that electric cooperatives are not subject to the storage rules. So in the rules themselves, there are a number of definitions. I put a few definitions on the screen here that I'm going to just briefly cover. First, the definition of energy storage. It's a very broad definition, and it means any technology that is capable of absorbing energy, storing that energy for a period of time, and then redelivering that energy after storage. The definition of energy storage facility is also broad, and it includes an energy storage resource and any equipment needed to interconnect the energy storage resource to the utility's electric system. It also includes equipment such as switchgear or transformers, inverters, communication and control devices, fire protection, and environmental protection systems. One thing just to note, and I think Bob might cover this in his portion, is that the definition expressly excludes transmission or distribution lines. So just something to be mindful of, because depending on who will build and own that particular type of facility, they may be subject to some other permitting requirements. There's also definitions I've got on the screen here for energy storage capacity and energy storage power rating. I won't go over those, but those definitions are on the PowerPoint and in the rules. So as I mentioned earlier, the VCEA establishes requirements for APCo and Dominion to construct or acquire new utility-owned energy storage resources by the end of 2035. So the issue before the commission were what were the interim targets between now and then. So under the storage rules, the SEC established the following minimum interim targets. For APCo, by December 31st, 2025, APCo is to construct or procure 25 megawatts. By December 31st, 2030, APCo is to procure an additional 125 megawatts for a total of 150. And then by December 31st, 2035, based on the VCEA, APCo is to procure the full 400 megawatts. Now for Dominion, the interim targets that were set up were by December 31st, 2025, Dominion is to construct or procure 250 megawatts. By December 31st, 2030, there's an additional 950 for a total of 1,200. And then by December 31st, 2035, as the VCEA requires, they have to acquire the full 2,700. One thing to note too is that under the VCEA, that requires that at least 35% of the energy storage facilities placed in service shall be purchased by APCo or Dominion from a party other than the public utility, or owned by a party other than the utility with the capacity that's sold to the utility. And under the rules, they actually applied the 35% threshold to each of those interim targets that I just went over. Now, in terms of the APCo and Dominion procurement, the rules provide that beginning this year and ending in either 2035 or when the storage targets are met, APCo and Dominion shall sponsor at least one competitive solicitation for energy storage projects per calendar year. The requests for proposals are to be publicly announced and made available for public review on the utility's website at least 60 calendar days prior to the closing of the RFP. The rules give pretty wide latitude to APCo and Dominion to evaluate responses, but the rules themselves do address certain minimum criteria to be considered as part of the selection process, such things as the age of the existing facility, the financial viability of a project or the developer's prior experience in the field, the location and effect of the transmission grid on the energy storage facility on the transmission grid. Some of the benefits to the Commonwealth associated with that particular project, And also it includes how the project impacts the goals established by the Virginia Environmental Justice Act. Now, each year, the APCo and Dominion are to report any competitive solicitations for energy storage projects as part of its annual plan that they submit to the SEC. So now I'm going to just briefly cover what's in the storage rules relating to energy storage aggregators. The rules define energy storage aggregator as a person or entity that, as an agent or intermediary, offers to purchase or purchases energy storage system capacities, or offers to arranges for the purchase of energy storage system capabilities for the purposes of combining or aggregating those capabilities to enable the participation of multiple energy storage systems in electricity markets. So the rules provide that each person other than APCo or Dominion seeking to conduct business as an energy storage aggregator is to obtain a license from the Commission. And the rules include a number of specific application requirements, including information relating to the party's general financial fitness to operate as an energy storage aggregator, and then information to demonstrate their technical fitness. After an application is then submitted, the SEC will enter an order providing notice to appropriate persons, an opportunity to comment on the application. And then the rules provide that the Commission is to issue a license upon a finding that the applicant satisfies the requirements that are laid out in the rules. Also, it's important to note too that the energy storage aggregator is to submit to the utility notice if it's intent to operate, proof of their licensure from the SEC. Also, there are several requirements pertaining to their customer service contracts. So it's important to look at those and make sure contracts include those provisions. Now I'm going to pass it off to Bob, who will cover the permitting of non-utility energy storage facilities under the storage rules, and also the new legislation expanding the PBR statute to include energy storage facilities. Bob?
Well, thank you, Brad, and good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Today, as Brad mentioned, I will focus on the SEC's storage rules as they apply to non-utility energy storage facilities, and not discuss the applicability to APCo or to Dominion Virginia Power. Starting back at the beginning, like generating units, energy storage facilities inject power into the grid. And so the State Corporation Commission determined that it was logical that the permitting process be similar to that of electric generating units. So the permitting process, you'll see as we discussed a little bit below, set forth in the rules is structured to be similar to the Commission's existing rules for non-storage generating facilities that would be certificated by the Commission under Section 580D. And they're also similar to the guidelines applicable to solar and wind facilities participating in the Commission's pilot program for third-party PPAs. So if you're familiar with those programs, the rules for storage you will recognize as being very similar because they were based on those existing structures. Now, the Commission has indicated that once additional experience is gained in energy storage, that the Commission may find streamlining the current rules to be reasonable, and we'll just have to wait and see how that plays out as we get more people filing with the Commission for permitting certificates of storage facilities. All right, what size of storage facility is subject to the storage rules? Basically, if you have an energy storage facility of 1 megawatt or greater, you need a permit or a certificate under 56-580D. If your storage facility is less than 1 megawatt, you need to submit a letter to the director of the SEC's Division of Public Utility Regulation and to the utility in whose service footprint your project sits. But before we move on a little bit, I want to say that during the debate for these rules, there was significant discussion about the appropriate threshold for these rules. Originally, the rules were put out to indicate that if your storage project was over 100 kilowatts, you would need a permit or a certificate. There was some back and forth, and the industry indicated that if you were developing a 5 megawatt gas plant, you would not need a certificate. But anyhow, the Commission came out and some actually argue that 20 megawatts and above for storage should not require a certificate or a permit. But at the end of the day, the commission established the 1 megawatt or greater concept. So if you're 1 megawatt or greater, you need a permit. So stay tuned again. The commission may revisit the 1 megawatt threshold. As Brad mentioned, there's a task force, of which Brad is a member, by the way, that will view and review some of these issues. So basically, when you file for a permit or certificate with the commission, there's 3 areas that the commission will look at. We'll get in later, there's 17 specific details that you have to submit, but these are 3 critical areas that the commission must review and determine before they grant your permit or your certificate. Let's look at the first. The first is the commission must make a determination that there is no material adverse effect on reliability of electric service provided by any regulated public utility. I'll get in a little bit more into that in a minute. The second is that the project does not adversely impact any goal established by the Virginia Environmental Justice Act. And third, the project has to be deemed to be not otherwise contrary to the public interest. Let me focus for a minute, if we could, on the concept of no adverse effect upon reliability of electric service provided by an electric utility. Again, during the debate on the rules, there was a lot of back and forth on, look, these projects all go or typically go through a project with a process with PJM or the utility where they look at the various issues regarding reliability. And one question was, look, if my project goes through the PJM process, shouldn't that be enough to verify no material adverse effect? The commission understood that, and of course indicated that although PJM and NERC have responsibilities to safeguard the reliability of the grid, PJM and NERC are only focused on the bulk electric transmission system. So what the commission indicated is that the states, and the SEC in particular in Virginia, have near complete responsibility over the safety, reliability, and adequacy of the distribution grid and how that impacts end-use customers. So the commission indicated it's not going to abdicate its responsibility regarding the distribution grid, although certainly compliance with PJM and NERC and other relevant authorities could be evidentiary value to finding no material adverse effect. The commission staff will most likely review and verify issues put out by PJM and may even verify and review the flow modeling that is initiated by PJM for each project. So that's important to know and anticipate before you file. The second criteria that the commission must find is that your project does not adversely impact any goal established by the Environmental Justice Act. As probably many of you know by now, the General Assembly has made it the Commonwealth of Virginia's policy to pursue environmental justice, and the commission has found it reasonable to recognize that requirement in the energy storage rules. So contemplate that before you file, do your analysis before you complete your application, and that will be helpful to move your project along in the process at the commission. And the third one, of course, is not otherwise contrary to the public interest. Now, that requirement, as the first requirement, is also included in Section 580D, and it's part of the commission generation rules. So if you're familiar with the generation rules for non-renewable energy projects, you also have to prove that your project is not otherwise contrary to the public interest. So those are the 3 criteria you have to focus on during your application. And then you go down into the detail. The commission requires information in 17 different areas. I won't go over each of the 17. They're all set forth into regs. I'll hit some of the highlights. One of the first ones is the financial information about the applicant itself. The commission has indicated that the proof of financial viability is a very important consideration for consumer protection, and therefore it's going to require applicants to submit financial information about the applicant itself. As Brad mentioned, the VCEA provides that at least 35% of energy storage facilities are going to be purchased by the public utility from a party other than the public utility and owned by a party other than the public utility. So particularly given this large carve out, the commission believes it's important that the non-utility storage providers be financially viable and be entitled or able to produce and produce the storage in a reputable and consistent manner with financial backing. Actually, the commission mentioned in its order, if, for example, a storage provider were to default on an energy storage agreement, the utility may have to replace that resource, which would be a higher cost to customers. Environmental concerns, if they came up, would need to be addressed by the developer, and therefore the commission wanted a financially viable developer. And of course, if the entity goes bankrupt, there may be some issues there. So the commission is going to focus on the financial viability of the applicant. And you'll find that this is not unusual at the commission either. You'll find comparable financial information is also required on issues where the commission issues licenses, such as a competitive service provider license application, or a competitive local exchange carrier application, or electric and natural gas aggregators have to provide the same thing. So again, it's consistent with what the commission has done in other areas. It's just new to the storage rules themselves. Moving on down, I guess I won't go into much detail on these, but you have to put in your qualifications, including other projects developed and managed. So if you have a good history of other storage projects, the commission will want to see that. It'll go a long way to helping your application move through the process. A description of the proposed storage site. And this is somewhat unusual, I guess, but you have to have a description of the location and a map that's suitable for newspaper publication. We'll get into the notice a little bit later, but there's some details that will need to be put in local newspapers that will be required to be put into your application. The status of the site acquisition, description of zoning and land use approvals, and things of that sort. Now, this is unique, of course, to the storage rules, but the applicant must describe in detail the proposed storage facility, which will include major systems, intended use, the storage technology type, and battery chemistry type is important. As we get to a little bit later, when the new regulation, the new statute comes out moving storage, or at least allowing DEQ to issue a permit by rule for storage, the battery chemistry type is important in that legislation. Useful life, configuration, things of that sort, site layout, codes and standards, and manner of the interconnection to the transmission or distribution facility, which will go back to the first point we talked about earlier on reliability, not interfering with the utilities service. There's also a few things where the applicant is required to demonstrate and indicate and describe the selection process that it went through to pick a particular energy storage technology, and discuss any competitive procurement process that was used to obtain that equipment. So that's an interesting obligation that you'd need to think about. The economic developments of impacts of the project itself, and then a list of local, state, and federal agencies and permits that would be required for the storage project, in addition, of course, to your permit or your certificate from the commission. And I'm sure you all have put those together for many other aspects of the project, and a similar PBR on the way. Environmental impact of the project is also important. And the way it works is you fill out the application, and the way we do it, and a lot of others would do it, is you put together a DEQ supplement, where it's actually a tearaway, because the way it works is the staff, you file your application, the staff then commences consulting with DEQ on wetlands and other coordinated environmental review. And the DEQ will develop information for the SEC staff about potential impacts of natural and cultural resources associated with the storage project. And the DEQ will actually coordinate a review with numerous government agencies. And the agencies would include, for example, Department of Conservation and Recreation, Wildlife Resources, Health, Historic Resources, Virginia Outdoors Foundation, Marine Commission, things of that. And the DEQ puts together a report and then submits it to the commission, which is filed and put on record. And then the commission staff will consult with that document to put together, we think, the permit and the certificate application. And also be wary here, a lot of times the DEQ will put in recommendations that may turn into obligations under your permit. So watch those carefully, and you're going to be working with all the same agencies you had before to work that through. So I won't go through all these things, but the application is required to identify all of these items in your application. And the more detail you put in here, I think the quicker the staff and the DEQ will be able to process the application itself. A new concept at the commission, I guess elsewhere in Virginia, is you're required to put in an analysis of the social impact of the project. And this includes a discussion of why the facility will not have a disproportionate adverse impact on historically and economically disadvantaged communities as set forth in the Virginia Code. And the application is also required to address how the project will promote environmental justice in environmental justice communities and fence lines communities. And that is consistent with the Virginia Environmental Justice Act. And we have the statute reference there for you to look at. The reliability impacts, I guess we went through this a little bit earlier, but it's one of the 3 criteria that the commission has to determine. So this part of your application, you will address all those various things. You need to discuss the interconnection requirements, what facilities will be needed, the potential impact on the interconnected system. And most of those will be coming forth in your Dominion or APCo studies or your PJM studies or all the engineering studies that would verify that. But you need to submit those with your application to work that through in the application. The safety measures are a requirement. You need to address the fire protection, mitigation measures, emergency response plans. A lot of these issues you will have worked through with your local community. Maybe your CUP process or your SUP process will focus on that. So you'd want to reference those obligations or commitments in this storage application. And then the useful life of the facility itself, the projected performance, round trip efficiency, and importantly, the plan for and cost for decommissioning. And I know you're very familiar with those items on the solar side. So that is also going to be required on the battery side for the commission review. Again, whether the proposed facility is not contrary to the public interest, it includes analysis of known impacts on the reliability of service and rates to be paid by any public utility providing service in Virginia. Notice requirements. What will happen when you file the application at first, the commission will hopefully issue a scheduling order, and the commission will then provide notice to appropriate persons with an opportunity to provide comment. But that has to be included in your application. And then the interconnection process, the applicant must complete either the PJM process in this case, or the process with your local utility, depending if you're on a PJM line or a utility line. But you have to complete each of those processes before you get your application issued. Finally, and not finally, I should say, but next, but this is very important, and it's a rule, excuse me, a statute has been passed. It won't be effective until July 1 of this year, but it amended the definition, as Brad mentioned, of small renewable energy project to include going forward an energy storage project that uses electrochemical cells to convert energy with a rated capacity not exceeding 150 megawatts. I'm going to stop there just for a minute, because the electrochemical cells is a subset of storage, right? So for example, a pumped hydro storage facility is a storage facility, but does not use, I think typically does not use electrochemical cell process. So some of the storage will stay at the commission. Some of the storage projects will move to the DEQ, but the requirement is you have to have electrochemical cells that convert energy below 150 megawatts to go over to the DEQ under the permit by rule process. And that will include the hybrid project and energy storage parameters of those issues. And the DEQ is required to promulgate regulations by the beginning of next year. So the process should be interesting to watch. I don't think we've seen anything yet from DEQ and how they intend to do that. The statute's not effective until July 1, so we're anticipating DEQ would put out draft regulations sometime in the fall, asking for comments on those, and then the regulations we would think would be finished by January 1 of 22. And as you also know, or you may know, the DEQ is also revising their permit by rule regulations right now. And the comments for those are due in mid-May. So the DEQ has its hands full because they will be processing the new permit by rule changes, at the same time amending their permit by rule regulations to include the include the battery processes. So they will have two major rulemakings at the same time. We're not sure how they're going to do it. Are they going to combine it? Are they going to keep them separate? And I guess it's possible that they could be on separate tracks. But stay tuned for that. As we learn more, we'll let everyone know. But that's a very important issue. So at the end of the day, what will happen is a battery solar developer looks like they're going to have two agencies to consider. One is State Corporation Commission for a permit or a certificate of public convenience and necessity, or if they have electrochemical cells below 150 megawatts, they could choose to go to the DEQ for a new permit by rule. So there'll be some various options that we can analyze and work through to see the pros and cons and benefits of each. But I think it's a good development.
Bob, I think we're running a little long, so I think we might have time for maybe just one or two questions. So let's get to those.
Okay.
One of the first questions I see is, are there any fees to file a permit application for a BESS?
No. That's a good question. I know at DEQ, there's some fees, and the new regulations at DEQ, they're trying to have some annual fees that would help DEQ pay for the review. The State Corporation Commission does not charge any fees for a permit application, and there are no fees for annual inspections or anything of that sort going forward. So the answer, Brad, is no fees at the State Corporation Commission.
All right. I'll take the next one. Do any type of energy storage technology count towards the minimum interim targets? So the rules provide that any type of energy storage technology will count towards those interim targets. So it's technology agnostic based on the rules. Let's see, there's some other questions, but I don't think we have time to get to all of them. So Bob, I think I've got one last question for you. If you have filed a PBR or intend to file a PBR for your solar project, can you also file a permit for an energy storage facility from the SEC?
Oh, can you repeat that, Brad? I didn't get the whole question.
Sure. If you filed a PBR for your solar project, can you file a permit application with SEC for an energy storage project?
Yes. Yeah, okay, thank you. Yes, you can do that. So you could have a permit from the commission for your battery storage or certificate for your battery storage, and at the same time have a permit by rule for your solar facility. But there's one thing we need to keep in mind, and some of you may be aware of, if you have a Gentile line or distribution line or transmission line or something connected with that project, you would need to go to the commission with that at this point for sure. You would get your permit by rule at the commission at the DEQ for your solar, and you get your permit or certificate at the commission for your battery component. So there's a lot of moving pieces there, and I may have given a little more information than needed in that question, but that's how that ends up. Happy to help, but the statutes are where they are.
All right, well, I think we'll wrap it up. I know we've got some other questions, so we will respond to those by email afterward. Bob, thanks a lot for joining me today. And I also want to thank everybody for attending and sending in your great questions. If you've got any other questions, our contact information is on the screen now, so feel free to reach out to us. And thank you again for everybody for attending.
Yeah, great seeing everyone. Thanks all.